it's a tricky question. I think there are certain aspects of being an American composer, such as a very Catholic taste in terms of what you can do. You can pretty much write any kind of music here that you want. There isn't some kind of national style or some group of people that more or less compose who's successful and who isn't successful. So in that sense, I certainly feel like an American. I would also say that I'm sure a lot of my rhythmic sense, and there's a certain kind of plain-spokenness to my music and a lot of other American composers' music that I think is more uniquely ours. Not so much, though, in terms of consciously evoking American subjects or writing Americana. Certainly there have been lots of composers who have done that, and there continue to be some today. So I would guess that in terms of Americanness in my music, it's not something I'm consciously thinking of when I'm composing. I think it probably just kind of comes through in certain ways that I'm not really thinking about. I love a lot of music, which it seems to me is a prerequisite for anyone to be a musician. Is you've got to love music and know as much of it as you can. And there have been so many composers over the years that have meant a great deal to me. Many of them are 18th, 19th, whatever century composers whose music may not have a direct, recognizable influence on my work, but certainly there's so many 20th century composers. It would take me all afternoon really to list them all. Some of them I'm very conscious of, and some of them I do even try to knowingly pay homage to in various works of mine. I don't try to hide the influences that I'm conscious of. But there are also influences that I may not be so conscious of. People have found things in my work or influences that would never have occurred to me. So it's as much what the listener brings to the experience as it is what the composer brings. Only towards the end of his life. We had just, I didn't live in New York, and although I knew Schumann and Copland, they'd been very supportive of me when I was young, just never came into the Bernstein orbit until really, literally, the last year and several months of his life. And actually the work that you're doing, Bump, was a work that he heard as part of a kind of a tour that several young American conductors and composers were involved in with him. And Bump certainly has something to do with the dance at the gym from West Side Story, which I told him, and he said, yes, but at least mine has a tune, which is true. Mine is not full of rousing tunes. It was inspired by a dream that I had in which the Boston Pops was doing a tour performance in hell. And all the demons lined up, formed a conga line, and this was the music that they danced to in the dream. I did kind of think out a little bit and move the conga, the typical conga beat 1/16 later, so it occurs in my piece squarely on the fourth beat. But there's a bass drum, thump, every fourth beat for the entire piece, which represents the throwing of the hips out in a conga line. I had, in mind this image of kind of a La Valse meeting, a disco or some other, a nightclub kind of experience. So it's meant to be nightmarish, but also meant to be fun. Although, no, it's true, there are not tunes in it, and it's actually, pretty aggressive and pretty gnarly in terms of the harmony. But it really is meant to be fun in its own twisted way. Originally, I had conceived it as a separate work, but then a friend of mine convinced me that another little piece that I had written called The Infernal Machine would make a nice movement of a triptych, and that piece was inspired by a dream as well. So I just put together 3 dreams that I had, in which Bump would be the last, and said that you could still do The Infernal Machine separately, you could still do Bump separately, or you could play the entire triptych. The first movement does not stand alone, I don't think so. You can only hear it as part of the whole piece, but that was another strange dream that I had, so. Well, since I only work on commission, I'm kind of, I shouldn't say limited, but with each project that I accept, I have certain boundaries that I have to work within, length and instrumentation and so forth. And usually I won't take a commission if I don't think I can realize it very well, if for some reason I just don't think I could write a good piece. So the ones that I take on will usually already have some idea, some concept of what the piece is about, what it's trying to say. That's always the first thing. Then how does it begin and how does it end? What will be the way stations? If I start at A and end at Z, and this is all done mentally. I don't do any physical sketching. I just think a lot. And when I basically have way stations A, D, G, K, M, and so forth, then I'll actually start the writing process. I won't know everything about the piece, far from it, but I'll have a sense of where I'm going. I'll have a sense of the structure, a pretty good sense of that. And we'll still be making lots of on-the-spot decisions as I go. And the only thing I actually write, and I still work by hand, is the final score. I don't sketch because I don't know, I'm too lazy, I guess. Hate to waste paper. I just do it in my head. And we'll usually let a piece gestate for a year or two before I'll start writing. And then just in terms of work habits, well, I'd still work with a pencil, regular old yellow pencil, paper, and sit at a card table in the living room with the television on. I have to have some kind of mindless babble on when I compose. No music. I can't have music on, but if it's a talk show or a ball game or Days of Our Lives, I follow Days of Our Lives. Something that's essentially talking, I can write much more efficaciously. And every once in a while, it's happened a couple times over the years that I've worked myself into a thicket. I may get 4 or 5 pages into a piece and realize, oh no, this is not right. In which case I go back and start over again. Well, it's kind of cynical, but the first thing I say is, if you can imagine doing anything else, do it. The only reason to become a composer is because you're not alive unless you're composing. You have to do it. You are impelled to do it. It's not fun, and I find it very disagreeable. And most of my colleagues that I've spoken to about it do not enjoy the process of composing. So you do it because you know you have to. You'd be even more miserable if you weren't doing it than if you are doing it. And as George Bernard Shaw said about writing, and the same thing I think would apply to any composer, creative artist, he said, I despise writing, but I enjoy having written. So that when your work is finished and you hear what you've done in the case of a composer and you feel that it came out okay, that's the reward. But the process of actually getting it down on the page is very painful and difficult. The old Hollywood image of the composer sitting there ecstatically taking dictation from the angels or whatever, it's not that way at all. It's hard and often tedious and extremely frustrating work. You know what you're trying to get, but you don't know how to get it on the page. You can't figure out exactly the best way to say what you're trying to say. It never really was that straightforward a proposition for young composers to get orchestra performances. If it's more difficult now, it's because there are more composers than there ever were before. There are more young composers than ever. But the opportunities were always very limited. The orchestra world is, like the opera world, a difficult one to break into. And it's like being a conductor. How do you practice conducting until you have an orchestra to conduct? And how do you become a successful orchestra composer until an orchestra plays your music, and how does that come about? I mean, sometimes it happens as a result of readings. There are lots of orchestras now that do readings of young composers' music, and sometimes something sparks from that. But still, for composers who really want to write for the orchestra and are good composers, talented composers, there still are certainly opportunities, and people do have their ears to the ground. The artistic administrators of orchestras always looking for young talent, young composers, and that's how the Nico Mulleys and the Andrew Normans and the Mason Bateses and so forth emerge.